Mixing with Mike plugin of the week is the Eventide SP2016 Reverb. The SP2016 Reverb is a vintage reverb that goes back to the early 80s. 1982 was when it was released. And this plugin is a recreation of three of the programs that were part of that. Now, the interesting thing about this hardware unit when it was released was that it was designed to have multiple programs, and there wasn't really anything that did it at the time. But what you would actually do is you could buy chips and put those chips in to you actually have to open up the unit, put the chip in, and then you would get different programs. And they had all kinds of other multi-effects things. What this does is it actually gives you the three main programs which were the most popular within it, which is what it came stock with. And then you could purchase these chips separately. I have experience with the original hardware, but never with any of the other effects other than the ones that you see here. So what they've done is they've actually done an emulation of the original stereo room, the room, and the plate, or a plate, mechanical plate. And then there's a modern variation which is at a higher bit depth. So what they did is they kept the original bit depth to capture the original sound characteristic. Now, they don't really mention what that is. Given the timing, it was probably 16-bit, and the technology. Some of the early digital reverbs, like the EMT250, was an 8-bit digital reverb, which is something a lot of people don't know. So that bit doesn't necessarily mean the bit depth doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. Let's just put it that way. Let's just go over the quick part of the plugin here, and then we'll dive into some sounds. It's pretty straightforward. You have an input-output control. Bypasses the plugin. There's a kill switch, which actually kills the feed to the reverb. Okay, so this is actually on the original unit, if I remember correctly. You'll see the metering here, which will show you either input or output, depending upon where you have the arrow selected there. You see the program here, but if I change parameters here, that will show up on the display there. Again, we have the 6 different basic programs to set up. Now, if you do the stereo room is sort of like more of like a concert hall, as opposed to like a small room, where the room is actually more of a room, like a studio room. And the plate is meant to emulate, like a mechanical plate, like an EMT 140 kind of thing. So you have the basic setup there with the program. We have a wet-dry control, which is set up here. And that's pretty straightforward in case you put it on the insert of a track. Pre-delay, which is the amount of delay before the onset of reverb. You control the decay time, which goes from 200 milliseconds up to 100 seconds. So you have plenty of decay time there. Position. This is kind of an interesting one, because what will happen, because this technology is pretty sophisticated, and the effort and energy that they put into making this reverb sound really amazing. And one of the things that they spent a lot of time with was working on the early reflections. And so the early reflections and the reverb will sound different if you're in the back end of the room than if you're at the front end of the room. And this becomes an really important tool in doing reverb. And a lot of reverb plugins and things that you see now don't really have that. The diffusion is sort of like a density control with the reverb, but if you had this, say, here to a 0 setting, it would be like a room with flat walls. So you get these very hard, direct reflections, which are less diffused. The energy is stronger. When you get more diffusion, what happens is it breaks up that energy, so it comes in waves of more delays, and so you get the feeling like it's a little bit denser, and it creates a tonal coloration, so that's also a nice tool. If you need more tonal coloration, then you also have an EQ that's built in. It's pretty straightforward. You have basically a low shelf and a high shelf. You set the 2 frequencies here. You have booster gain, so the plus 4 dB down to minus 8 dB on the low frequency adjustment for the reverb, and the high frequency is an attenuation only, so at the top it's at 0, and at the bottom it's at minus 8 for the gain. And then you have frequency selection going from 8 kilohertz down to 1K. So essentially you can leave that completely flat, adjust it accordingly. Now let's go up here just very quickly to the bar here, because here you can load up all kinds of presets. They have presets, small, medium, large, massive, so you can load up different size. You could do it based on instruments, which is very cool. And you also have artist presets. So this is kind of cool, the way that they organized it, because those are the primary ways in which you might go ahead and load up presets to kind of go through the sounds. And I recommend that because you can notice the positioning. There's not a lot of knobs or settings here. And then you get the factory default, which will load everything back to its default settings. So from here, this is just basically clicking here or here is the same. This toggles through the presets plus or minus to the next one or previous one, so you can kind of click through them until you find one that you like. You could also load or save them. So this basically takes you to the same folder where those are stored, but you can store your own, and it would save it to that same location. You can create your own folder, place it anywhere in there, and then it would show up on the list. So if you come up with your favorite settings, you can do that. There's a compare feature when you change settings. The I/O lock is when you go through those presets, it'll lock the input-output gain structure. So if you set it up a certain way, you load up a preset, it may change those settings. Same thing with the mix lock, which may change the wet-dry balance. So you can lock those two features in so they don't change when you move from preset to preset. The info loads up the manual, that little I, and the cog here sets something so it always shows the slider values. So on the original hardware, you wouldn't necessarily see that. This just displays it here. Otherwise, you don't see it until you move it, and then it shows up in the big display over here. All right, so that's the basics of it. And so let's get into sound. So I started out with a little, got a drum set up. So I have all the drums feeding into one instantiation of this. So let's kind of dig into it a little bit and see what we got. So here's just a stereo room. And then I'll load up a couple of other programs here. So let's just actually, just to show you the difference here of what so this is the original bit depth, and then I'll load up the modern, which is a full 24-bit bit depth. So you can see that it's brighter, right? And a bit fuller sounding. So you may prefer that more modern full bit depth. But if you're going to the full vintage sound, then with the original bit depth, that's what you're going to get. Here's the room. One has a bit more character. The vintage, you see the V there or the M to show that it's modern. And here's the plate. Now you notice at the plate that certain settings disappear, and this is because on the original unit, when you loaded up this setting, then those features would be inactive. And in fact, on the original unit, there were some features that were they had sort of these generic labels, because depending upon the program, they would serve a different function in the program. And sometimes it confused people. So here's the high density plate. So you can see how there's a very different characteristic for them. Let's actually go to the vintage room, set up something here with the drums, and then I'll set up a plate reverb. We'll kind of play with that a little bit. So you see the wide range of even with the limited number of parameters here, but that position control is really powerful. You hear how you can really find the right space and shape it tonally. And I haven't even gotten into anything here. I'm just leaving this just as it is, flat, but I could also boost a little bit more low end if I wanted some energy that way. I'll just kind of leave that flat as it is. All right, let's move on to just to go to the snare sound here. So let's just go. We have I'll just load. We have a high density plate here, so let's just kind of load that up, or maybe put the drum reverb in a little bit better perspective here. So if I want to hear the variation of this and have more control over it, I can switch over to the modern version, which opens up these same position controls. In this case, I kind of, even though that's bigger sounding, I kind of like the vintage version here a bit better. So if you're curious, also this will work with vocals pretty well. So I have an another one set up here on the vocal, and so let's just have a listen to this here and kind of play around a little bit here with some different settings here for the vocal.
Out of reasons, running out of money, don't know what I was thinking.
So I have the position set farther back here in the stereo room. Let's just see if I can find some kind of balance here with the diffusion and the decay time, and also the amount of pre-delay.
Out of reasons, running out of money, don't know what I was thinking. Trying to get away, trying to get back, trying to start again, trying to get back to living. Well, if it's not love and it's not bad, I'll try to get back the best I ever had.
Maybe I'll dry it up a little bit by changing the position.
Out of reasons, running out of money, don't know what I was thinking. Trying to get away, trying to get back, trying to start again, trying to get back to living. Well, if it's not love, it's not bad, I'll try to get back, best I ever had.
So you can get a nice placement in there with that. Here, let's do a quick comparison here. I'm going to bypass this, make a copy of this, and then see if we can get a sound here with the plate.
Reasons, running out of money, don't know what I was thinking. Trying to get away, trying to get back, trying to start again, trying to get back to living. Well, if it's not love, it's not bad. I'm trying to get back, best I ever had. Yeah, if it's not love, it's not bad. I'm trying to get back, best I ever had.
Both have a kind of they have a very different approach. I kind of like the reverb, the room sound here.
The reasons running out of money, don't know what I was thinking.
But you can hear how effective it is. Sometimes the slightly more lo-fi nature of the vintage reverbs has a cooler effect in my mind, or maybe it's just something that I'm a bit more used to. But this is a pretty cool one, a great emulation of a classic hardware piece that you don't hear a lot about. But a lot of those units are still in use by a lot of real top-end mix engineers. So it's not like some kind of antiquated piece that somebody dusted off and there was only 2 of them ever made. There was actually a reverb that found a bit of popularity in a lot of studios in mix rooms. So a great one, Eventide, the SP2016 Reverb plugin, and it is the plugin of the week.